On June 14 of 2019, a family's life was shattered in a single instant. A simple trip to Costco near Riverside County in California became the backdrop of one of the most outrageous stories you would have ever heard. Three members of the French family, Paula, Russell, and their son Kenneth, were shot in cold blood by an off duty police officer, Salvador Sanchez. And shockingly, this man was allowed to step out of this whole situation without spending a single night in jail. How did this happen? How could a man with a badge shoot three people in the back and be allowed to go free? Today, we dive deep into the story of the French family, their fight for justice, and the undeniable question that still lingers. Why do some police officers seem to escape accountability time and time again? Hi, welcome to Collectively Vigilant. So, the French family were originally from Calcutta, India, and had moved to the United States about 5 years before the events of June 14 of 2019. The mother, Paula, was 59 years old and worked as a software professional. The father, Russell, was 57 years old and worked in finance, and their two sons, Kenneth, 32, and Kevin, 29, were both educated in Canada before the family ultimately moved from Canada to California. Both the sons had actually attended McMaster University, which is a much sought after name in Canada. Unfortunately, Kenneth had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and on top of it, he also had an intellectual disability brought on by schizophrenia. And he'd been struggling with this condition in the months leading up to the incidents that we're going to discuss today. By the time of the shooting that we're going to discuss, Kenneth was actually nonverbal and had the mental capabilities of a teenager. His condition unfortunately had worsened, and he was scheduled for medical tests, types of medical tests, in the coming weeks. But on June 14 of 2019, the French family had no idea that a routine trip to Costco would change their lives forever. So, it was after 7 p.m. when the French family entered Costco in Riverside County in California. Kenneth, Paula, and Russell were simply in line to sample sausages like many families do. But in the blink of an eye, a moment of impulse turned this whole peaceful scene into an absolute nightmare. Kenneth, unfortunately, without warning, sort of struck Salvador Sanchez in the head. And when I say struck, I literally mean like this. Not with any kind of force, not with the kind of force where you would think that somebody's brain would hemorrhage. We're just talking about someone who was suffering from schizophrenia, was out and about on that day, and Salvador was the man who was hit in the head, and Salvador Sanchez's family was just in line before the French family. So Salvador, his wife, and their 20-month-old son were all together on this day, just like Paula, Russell, and Kenneth were together on this day. Salvador was holding his 20-month-old son and had no idea that he'd been struck only by someone's hand. According to witnesses, Kenneth had a moment of confusion, something that his family had come to expect due to his schizophrenia and due to his intellectual disability. As soon as this whole thing happened, Paula and Russell immediately apologized to Salvador Sanchez, and they tried to move away, hoping to de-escalate this whole situation. But unfortunately, it was too late. Paula, catching a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye, saw Salvador Sanchez pull out a gun. In an instant, this whole serene atmosphere of Costco vanished, and it was replaced with chaos and fear of a mother trying to protect her family. Paula instinctively stepped in front of her husband and her son to shield them from all the bullets that were heading their way. The first shot rang out, striking Paula on the side. The bullet lodged itself into her stomach. She collapsed near the freezer aisle, gasping for breath. Next, Russell tried to shield Kenneth and was shot next in the stomach. And then the unthinkable. Salvador Sanchez, in absolute cold blood, fired 4 shots into Kenneth's back. In just 3.8 seconds, 3 lives were completely torn apart. As this shooting unfolded in the middle of Costco, shoppers were left frozen in absolute disbelief. Salvador immediately identified himself as an off duty LAPD police officer and forbade anyone from coming to the aid of the French family. But an elderly gentleman, in a final act of compassion, rushed towards Russell the father and asked if he could pray for him. Russell, his body struggling against his own injuries, turned to the elderly man and asked him to pray for Kenneth, who lay lifeless on the floor right next to his father. Meanwhile, as paramedics arrived, body cam footage revealed that Salvador Sanchez was sitting calmly on the ground. He claimed he had suffered a concussion during the incident and was being treated by the paramedics, while the French family was being rushed to intensive care. Salvador, who had claimed to have had a concussion, was later discovered to have absolutely no injuries whatsoever. Not a single scrape, and of course, no gunshot wounds. Still, Salvador Sanchez continued to claim that he had been shot in the head. Despite the clear evidence of Salvador's actions, 3 people shot in cold blood. The response from law enforcement was nothing short of shocking. Salvador was allowed to leave this entire incident without being arrested. He wasn't even handcuffed, he wasn't detained. He was allowed to walk away after giving a brief interview to his fellow police officers. He claimed that he had been shot by Kenneth in the head. But there was absolutely no evidence of even a scratch on this man's head. No blood, no wound, absolutely nothing. His story didn't add up. But he was never arrested. As the French family fought for their lives in the hospital, no one could understand why Salvador Sanchez was still free. How on earth could this happen? And then, a few months later, the French family learned something which made their grief even more unbearable. Salvador Sanchez wasn't just a man who had taken the lives of their son. He was a police officer, and his story was being treated with a level of importance which overshadowed the truth. He was being hailed the hero, and Kenneth, the deceased son, was being hailed as the villain. The French family was desperate for justice, and they began their fight. They pressured the Riverside County District Attorney's Office to press charges, but time and time again, they were told that they had no case. The law didn't seem to care that Salvador Sanchez that used his police-issued weapon to kill their son and had critically wounded Paula and Russell. So much so that when they were initially taken into the hospital, both of them were put in coma so that their bodies could be made to fight against the volley of bullets which had been thrown against them. The DA refused to file charges, despite this clear surveillance footage from Costco cameras which showed that the French family had walked away from Salvador Sanchez. No one seemed to be taking their side. Unfortunately, the footage did little to clarify what had truly happened. It was distant, it was blurry, and some angles were obscured because of aisles and shelves and stuff all over Costco. Still, it clearly shows that the French family was in fact moving away from Salvador Sanchez before all the shots rang out. The law enforcement ignored all this evidence. In total, Salvador Sanchez had discharged 10 bullets from his police-issued weapon. 4 of which, remember, were on Kenneth's back. 1 was inside Paula's liver, 1 was in Russell's kidney, and 4 had flown around Costco and lodged themselves in different aisles. Those 4 could have hit even more people. Nonetheless, the rumors were afloat. Salvador's version of story became the narrative which was being pushed by many law enforcement officers. Salvador claimed that Kenneth had a gun and that Salvador felt that he was under threat, and so was his son. Despite all the clear evidence pointing to the opposite, Salvador's lies were given more weight than the actual truth and actual CCTV footage. As if this injustice was not enough, the public response was even more chilling. Tweets started to get circulated praising Salvador Sanchez as a hero. They claimed that his actions were heroic, legendary, in fact, calling him a man who had acted in defense of his own family. But the truth was very different. In the background, Salvador's wife was heard in utter disbelief. She cried out and said, quote, "You shot an entire family," unquote. Even those closest to this man were grappling with the most monstrous reality of what Salvador Sanchez had done. Still, this man walked free. As the French family continued their fight for justice, one also saw patterns of something similar all over America. Despite the overwhelming evidence that many people of color are shot at by the police, those police officers are never brought to justice. The French family was not the only victim in this fight. We've seen this play out repeatedly against South Asians, where families are left devastated and justice system fails them and never makes the culprits responsible. In January of 2023, 26-year-old Jaanvi Kandula was killed by a Seattle police officer by the name of Kevin Dale in a hit and run case. She was simply crossing the street when she was hit by Kevin Dale's car and she died on the spot. Kevin Dale was in fact later caught on his own body cam footage, saying the following, quote, "She was 26. She had limited value," unquote. And once again, no charges were filed against this man. In fact, a fellow police officer was so outraged by what had happened, that police officer, in fact, released this video that we now know of. Otherwise, nobody would have even known that Kevin Dale had done that to Jaanvi Kandula. In 2015, in fact, a 57-year-old father who was visiting his son in Alabama was beaten by the police for not being able to articulate himself in English.
Progress comes in small steps for Suresh Patel. In his weekly rehab sessions, he's starting to walk again after he was pushed to the ground by police earlier this year. The incident left the 58-year-old grandfather partially paralysed. Suresh Patel had moved to America from Gujarat in India to help take care of his young grandson. And it was in February of this year that he went for a morning walk here on this street in a suburb of Huntsville, Alabama. A stroll close to his son's house was part of the daily ritual for Mr. Patel, who'd only been in the country a week. But that morning, a neighbour spotted him and called the police.
We've had a guy, he was doing it yesterday and today, just kind of wandering around in driveways.
What does he look like?
He's a skinny black guy. I've lived here for 4 years. I've never seen him before.
Hey, bud. Let me talk to you real quick.
Officers arrived shortly after and began asking Suresh questions. But unable to speak or understand English, he struggled to respond.
What's your name?
He's saying no English. He doesn't understand what you're saying.
Okay.
India.
India? Okay.
રોડના ઉપરના પથ્થરની લાઈન પર જે હું ગયો સીધા વોકિંગ કરવા ગયો એટલે સામેથી બૂમ પાડી એટલે ઊભો રહ્યો એટલે હું સીધો આવ્યા એટલે બે પગલાં ભર્યા મેં કે મારા હાઉસ 148 બતાવ્યું અને આવ્યા અને હાથ પકડ્યો એટલે ખીચા બહારથી તપાસ્યા તો રૂમાલ ને સોપારીને પડી ગઈ હતી એટલે મને નીચે ઘાસમાં પાડ્યો.
Stop trying to jerk away from me.
As his son, what went through your mind when you watched that video for the first time?
It was a very devastating video that I saw. How come you just walk in and break somebody's neck?
27-year-old police officer Eric Parker was fired and charged with third-degree assault. He's also been charged in a federal court with excessive use of force. The case has been tried twice, and both times the juries failed to reach a unanimous decision.
Is there anything you want to say about the outcome today?
Not at this time, thank you guys.
Mr. Parker said he didn't mean to hurt Mr. Patel, but had acted in the interest of officer safety after Mr. Patel refused to comply with his requests. During their arguments, the defence said, "When you come to the US, we expect you to follow our laws and speak our language. Mr. Patel bears as much responsibility for this as anyone."
Do I feel angry? Yes, of course. I do feel angry because of my dad already mentioned it 5 times that he doesn't speak English. And now you are using that as an excuse of force that has been used. Then yes, I'm disappointed on it.
The question remains the same. Why do police officers seem to escape accountability when they kill people of color, whether they be South Asians or any other kind of color? This pattern is truly undeniable. And for the French family, this tragedy is only one example of the wider injustice so many people face. So the French family was fighting to get justice for their son Kenneth. The district attorney's office time and time again refused to file any charges against Salvador Sanchez. And that's when, with the help of their lawyer, Dale Gillipo, they filed a charge in the civil courts.
All our lives forever. I just can't understand how someone can walk into a Costco, kill my brother, shoot both my parents, shoot my mom in her back, and then be able to go home that same night and sleep on their pillow while we're here struggling. They let him leave without detaining him, questioning him, or even arresting him. Further, I have information that Officer Sanchez returned to Costco the next day, only to be shown the video and then give his statement to a detective. If the officer is allowed to see the video, why can't my family or I or the public see the video?
In the civil courts, in fact, they won this case and they won a settlement of $17 million against Salvador Sanchez. The case was then finally brought to criminal court in 2021 and then once again in 2023. Salvador was first taken to court in 2021, but unfortunately, the jury was deadlocked and a mistrial had to be declared at that time. In 2023, yet again, he was put on trial on charges of voluntary manslaughter and 2 counts of assault with a fire weapon. The trial, in fact, just like all trials are, was a clash of narratives. Salvador's defense team was hailing this man as a hero, and they were saying that his actions were justified because Salvador Sanchez truly believed that Kenneth had a gun, and his belief was enough for killing Kenneth. The prosecutor, time and time again, on the other side of the narrative, kept painting Salvador Sanchez as a police officer who had clearly stepped out of the boundaries of morality and rational sense. The prosecutor was trying to show that Salvador Sanchez was truly a murderer who had used excessive force against an entire innocent family, none of whom were carrying a gun. Hell, they were not even carrying a knife. But even then, the trial was not the resolution that the French family had hoped for. After all the years of pain, after all the years of injustice, the jury was deadlocked. They could not come to any unanimous decision, and then this whole case ends in a mistrial. In February of 2024, the French family was hoping, and they were given this hope by the district attorney's office, that they will put Salvador Sanchez on trial yet again. However, 2 weeks before the trial was supposed to be set to start, the district attorney's office all of a sudden in a press conference says that we are not going to file any charges against Salvador Sanchez. So, despite all the evidence, despite CCTV footage which shows 3 people are walking away empty-handed away from Salvador Sanchez, despite all the hug and the public outcry, the French family's quest for justice has yet to be fulfilled. Unfortunately, as I said, This is not an isolated incident. We have seen this pattern happen time and time again. Police officers use their authority to harm, and yet they never get any accountability for it. They escape accountability. This is not just about one family. This is about a broader pattern, and we should all be demanding answers. Why do police officers seem to get away with murders of victims, especially victims who are people of color? Now, let's try to understand this whole thing from a criminological lens, and let's also try to understand the legality of taking someone to a civil court when the criminal court does not seem to hold those people in check. Right, now that we know the story of what happened to the French family, let's try to understand from a legal perspective why is it that the courts in the civil case would hold Salvador Sanchez responsible, but in the criminal trial he was not held responsible, or rather I should say that the jury was deadlocked. Okay, so let's try to explain this and in so doing, I'll also be able to explain to you the difference between a criminal case and a civil case. So in the criminal court, the state has to prove that a particular defendant, and in this case that would be Salvador Sanchez, had committed a crime like murder or manslaughter, and they have to prove this beyond any reasonable doubt, either to the judge or to the jury or both. And the prosecution has to prove this with the highest standard of proof in the legal system. The problem with this case is that though there was CCTV footage, it doesn't seem like it was enough to convict this man. Even though the surveillance camera and the testimonies of the two surviving victims, being Paula and Russell, both of them clearly said that they were retreating. They were trying to walk away from Salvador Sanchez. And we see that in the CCTV footage. It's just that the defense was running a parallel narrative where they were able to show somewhat convincingly, to the jury at least, that because of the fact that Kenneth had earlier pushed Salvador Sanchez and had hit him over the head with his hand, because of that, a man like Salvador Sanchez had a concussion, and because of that concussion, he saw something as a valid threat, which was not indeed a valid threat. In reality, this was an unarmed family out shopping inside a Costco. The only person who was dangerous there was Salvador Sanchez. But the defense was able to prove that Salvador Sanchez was in fact in reasonable doubt, not only was in reasonable fear, not only for his own safety and the safety of his 20-month-old son who he was holding in his arms. And when Kenneth had sort of pushed him and hit him over the head, he did end up falling on the ground and his son was in his arms at that time. So this sort of put a seed of doubt in the whole thing, at least for the jury it seems, and that's how Salvador Sanchez was able to get away with this whole case, because the jury was deadlocked, because there was a reasonable doubt in the minds of some jurors that maybe that's in fact what truly happened, that Salvador Sanchez perceived Kenneth as a threat because of the concussion. So that's why he was let go in the 2021 trial, and that's because the jury was deadlocked. Now, when it comes to a civil case, the threshold or the burden of proof is actually much lower. It's called the preponderance of evidence, which means that you basically have to show that more likely than not, Salvador Sanchez clearly was able to kill Kenneth, was able to hurt, grievously injure Paula, grievously injure Russell, and whether he had malice in his mind while he was doing that or not is not really required to be proven by the plaintiff. And in this case, the plaintiff was the French family, And of course, the defendant was Salvador Sanchez. And the French family, through their attorney, Dale Gallipo, was able to demonstrate that Salvador Sanchez, who was a sworn police officer, had wrongfully killed Kenneth and had caused serious physical and horrific injuries to both Paula and Russell. One person was lying in a coma with a non-functioning kidney. The other person was lying in the coma with a non-functioning liver for the longest time. So, of course, there was serious physical pain, ongoing physical trauma for the rest of their lives until they live. And on top of that, they also have the emotional trauma of having lost their 32-year-old son. And this whole thing stemmed from the negligent actions of a sworn police officer who was supposed to be de-escalating the situation, not escalating the situation, right? So the threshold of the burden of proof is much lower, and hence it's easier to get a settlement in the criminal court. That's why it's easier to get a settlement in the civil court. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that these people are now sitting pretty with a $17 million settlement. They, in fact, lost their son. They lost their ability to properly work. And especially because both of them were so close to getting a retirement, so close to a retirement age, they would not get an employment again. You and I both know that. Once you hit a certain age, that's it for you in the employment market. So the charges, the $17 million settlement, is truly not a pot of money that they're sitting on. It's something that they truly deserve. And this doesn't even come close to the emotional toll that the entire family has had to go through. So there is a financial restitution part of it, which does come from the civil courts, but truly, anybody would truly just feel vindicated if the criminal court had stepped in and said that indeed whatever Salvador Sanchez did was truly wrong and horrific, and he shouldn't have done that. And he should have been held responsible for it. But of course, the DA has refused to file charges again, and perhaps this will never go to a criminal court. Now, let's try to understand this now that we know the legal aspect of how the civil courts decide how much to give a person in terms of negligence and emotional pain. Now let's try to understand from a criminological standpoint why somebody like Salvador Sanchez would do what he did. Now, I say this in every episode, but just in case you're tuning in for the first time, you should hear me say this, that I'm not trying to excuse what Salvador Sanchez did. Absolutely not. But through criminology, we can try to understand why certain actions are taken by perpetrators. And in understanding this, perhaps we can reform this for the future. Anyway, so I believe that the first thing that does apply in the French family's case, when it comes to the perpetrator, Salvador Sanchez, is what is called the social learning theory by Albert Bandura. Now, Salvador Sanchez was a police officer, as you know, and as a police officer, all police officers are basically seen as people who enforce the law and they uphold the law, the letter of the law, and they are supposed to protect society. It is possible that Salvador Sanchez had come to believe, by looking at his fellow police officers, by observing his larger society, that excessive force was the norm, excessive force was acceptable, and to de-escalate a situation, the second you see someone as a threat, as you and I both know, in the US, it's remarkably easy to get a weapon. So even police officers are of course, they're always on alert because they don't know which civilian is carrying a weapon, right? So in that sense, it's a learned thing by people like Salvador Sanchez, where they see justification, they seek justification in using excessive force, and because it's been normalized for them. Everybody does it, why wouldn't you do it, right? So that's one way to understand it. Usually, whenever I explain it to students, they completely always take examples from around them. Whenever I try to sort of explain labeling theory to my students, they completely understand it in a minute, because all of us in real life at some point have been labeled, right? Somebody gets labeled as a smart kid, somebody gets labeled as the quiet kid, somebody gets labeled as the problematic child, right? The minute you get labeled, unfortunately, in life, we all sort of live up to a label. If you're the smart kid, you would always want people to perceive you as the smart, intelligent child for the rest of your life. In this way, if we look at Salvador Sanchez, he has been labeled as a hero, as a police officer who does all this great work in his everyday life. And inside his mind, perhaps Salvador Sanchez thought for a minute that I'll be the protector and I will step in and I will save my son and I will save everyone else in this Costco from a man who was not even a threat. He didn't even have a weapon. So he ended up brutally murdering someone who was an innocent person who was suffering from schizophrenia and was mute at the time of his death. So in that sense, what kind of hero was it, right? But inside his mind, he of course must have labeled himself as a hero, and there were subsequent tweets from his supporters that were saying that thank God Salvador Sanchez was there to save this entire Costco from 3 innocent people who were shopping, unarmed individuals who were simply out shopping. Anyway, but that's how we might explain this whole situation, through labeling theory. Now, of course, as I always say in every episode, one particular theory does not systematically explain an entire crime to us. However, if we take a couple of theories together, maybe we can try to figure out why a certain crime happened. So the last one, I would say, my students hate it because I always tell them Merton's strain theory applies almost everywhere. Especially it does apply to a job like being a police officer, because police officers are so constantly always under strain, especially in a country like US, where everyone seems to be walking around with a weapon. At least in certain states, people do walk around with weapons openly. So you would constantly be under threat, and especially because this job requires you to be a hero at all times. So that kind of pressure, societal pressure, would make you believe that it is legitimate to perceive even the smallest of a trigger, smallest of a threat as a big dangerous event. And that's why under this strain, probably he was always under this kind of strain, and he acted out perhaps because of that. Now, of course, in no way does this justify what he did against Kenneth, an innocent person and his innocent family members, but it does explain to us that police officers at times react before they can even think. It's because they always have that damn gun on them, right? So perhaps this sort of explains why Salvador Sanchez did what he did. And of course, one must say that the justice system has failed to hold Salvador Sanchez responsible. So that brings us to the end of this episode. And as we always say here on the YouTube channel and on the podcast as well, that we can give each other so much more than just our thoughts and prayers, especially to the French family. We can give them so much more than just our sympathy. We can give them our collective vigilance. We can look out for these kind of police officers. We can put pressure on the DA's office to hold people like Salvador Sanchez responsible, or the kind of people who killed Jaanvi Kandula and get away with it. That's a man called Kevin Dale. And people who brutally assault a 57-year-old man out on an evening walk on his own street, who just simply couldn't communicate in English. That was his only crime, and now he lies paralyzed for the rest of his life. So we can give each other so much more than our thoughts and prayers. We can give each other our collective vigilance. So tell me what you thought about this episode. Let me know in the comments. And if you have any suggestion, or if you disagree with something that I said, please, let's just start a debate, and hopefully we will do this in a civil fashion. But I do look forward to hearing from you. So until I see you again, stay collectively vigilant.